When my neighbor Marcus pounded on my apartment door at 5 o'clock in the morning, frantically insisting I could not leave for work, I thought he had lost his mind. By noon that same day, I discovered his desperate intervention had saved my life in ways I could never have imagined, setting off a chain of events that would expose a web of deception I had been living inside for 3 years without knowing it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this story truly begins, to the person I was before that Tuesday morning shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. My name is Claire Donovan, and at 31 years old, I had built what I considered a successful, stable life in Minneapolis. I worked as a senior data analyst for Meridian Financial Services, a mid-sized investment firm located in the gleaming glass towers of downtown. The position demanded precision, attention to detail, and the ability to identify patterns in complex datasets that others might miss. I had earned my role through 6 years of consistent performance, starting as a junior analyst fresh out of graduate school, and working my way up through promotions earned through late nights, weekend work, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. The job paid well enough that I could afford a comfortable one-bedroom apartment in the uptown neighborhood, an area known for its tree-lined streets, local coffee shops, and a sense of community that felt increasingly rare in modern urban environments. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted historic building, with hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly when I walked across them, large windows that let in abundant natural light, and enough space for the life I had carefully constructed. That Monday evening, the night before everything changed, I followed my usual routine with the comfortable predictability I had come to rely on. I left the Meridian offices at 6:15 in the evening, slightly later than my typical departure time because I had been working on a comprehensive quarterly report analyzing investment patterns across our client portfolios. The report was due to my supervisor, Kenneth Brennan, by Wednesday morning, and I wanted to ensure every figure was verified, every trend properly contextualized, every recommendation backed by solid data. The October air held the crisp edge of approaching winter, as I walked the 3 blocks from my office building to the parking garage where I kept my reliable 7-year-old Honda Civic. The vehicle was practical rather than impressive, which suited me perfectly. I had never been someone who needed external status symbols to feel successful. My satisfaction came from work well done, from financial stability carefully built, from the independence I had fought to establish after growing up in a household where money was always tight and stability always temporary. I stopped at the grocery store on my way home, navigating the familiar aisles with efficient purpose. I selected ingredients for simple meals I would prepare throughout the week. Boneless chicken breasts that I would grill and portion for salads and grain bowls. Fresh vegetables including bell peppers, zucchini, and leafy greens that I knew would provide nutrition without requiring elaborate preparation. Whole grain bread, Greek yogurt, fresh fruit, the building blocks of the healthy but uncomplicated diet I maintained to fuel long work hours without weighing me down. The grocery store cashier, a young woman named Emma who often worked the evening shift, greeted me with the recognition of someone who had checked out my purchases dozens of times. We exchanged pleasantries about the cooling weather and the approaching holiday season. These small interactions represented the extent of my social connections in daily life, brief moments of human contact between long stretches of solitary focus on work and personal responsibilities. I arrived home at 7:30, parking in my assigned spot in the small lot behind the apartment building and gathering my grocery bags and work laptop case. The building's back entrance required a key card for access, a security feature I appreciated given that I often arrived home after dark during the winter months. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs rather than waiting for the building's single, slow elevator, appreciating the small amount of physical activity after a day spent sitting at my desk analyzing spreadsheets and financial models. My apartment welcomed me with the quiet emptiness I had grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. I had lived alone since moving to Minneapolis for this job, and had generally found the solitude more peaceful than lonely. I was not antisocial by nature, but I had learned through experience that I needed significant time alone to recharge, to process my thoughts, to maintain the mental clarity that made me effective at my demanding work. I put away my groceries with methodical efficiency, placing items in their designated locations in my small but well-organized kitchen. Everything had its place, a habit formed partially from my analytical nature, and partially from living in a space where clutter quickly became overwhelming. I prepared a simple dinner of grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and quinoa, eating while reading through news articles on my tablet about market trends and economic indicators that might affect the recommendations in my quarterly report. After dinner, I washed my dishes immediately, another habit born from the discipline required to maintain order in a busy life. I changed into comfortable clothes and spent an hour reviewing my work from earlier in the day, making notes on sections that needed strengthening, and flagging additional data points I wanted to include. The report was important not just for its immediate purpose, but because Kenneth had mentioned that the executive team would be reviewing it as part of their strategic planning process. Doing exceptional work on this assignment could potentially position me for advancement opportunities one had been quietly working toward. At 9:30, I closed my laptop with satisfaction. The work was progressing well, and I felt confident I would have a polished final product ready by Wednesday morning with time to spare. I went through my evening routine with the same organized approach I applied to everything in my life. I laid out my clothes for the next day, selecting a navy blue blazer and gray slacks that conveyed professionalism without being overly formal. I prepared my coffee maker so it would automatically brew at 5:15 the next morning. I packed my lunch, the leftover quinoa and vegetables portioned into a glass container, and placed it in the refrigerator along with a small container of mixed berries I would eat as a mid-morning snack. I set my alarm for 5 o'clock in the morning, the same time I woke up every weekday. The early start allowed me to arrive at the office by 6:30, giving me 90 minutes of quiet, uninterrupted work time before most of my colleagues arrived and the typical distractions of the workday began. Those early morning hours were often my most productive, when my mind was fresh and the office was silent except for the hum of computers and the distant whoosh of the building's heating system. Before bed, I stood at my apartment window looking out over the neighborhood, a habit I had developed over the years of living here. The street below was quiet, the sidewalks empty except for an occasional person walking a dog or returning home from an evening out. The trees that lined the street were nearly bare now, their leaves having fallen in the past few weeks to create colorful carpets on the sidewalks that city workers would eventually clear away. Streetlights cast pools of yellow light at regular intervals, creating a pattern that I found somehow comforting in its predictability. My life was not exciting by most standards, I knew that. I did not have an active social calendar filled with events and gatherings. I did not date, having decided after a painful breakup 3 years ago that I needed to focus on my career and personal development before investing emotional energy in romantic relationships that might prove disappointing or distracting. I did not have hobbies that others would find particularly interesting. My friends from college had scattered across the country, and while we maintained contact through occasional messages and social media interactions, we rarely saw each other in person. But my life was stable, and stability was something I valued more than excitement. I had grown up watching my parents struggle with financial insecurity, with jobs that appeared and disappeared unpredictably, with the stress that came from never quite knowing if there would be enough money to cover basic expenses. I had watched relationships in my family fracture under the pressure of uncertainty and hardship. I had learned early that security required discipline, that stability had to be built deliberately through consistent choices and careful planning. My career at Meridian Financial Services represented the culmination of years of focused effort. I had worked multiple jobs to put myself through undergraduate studies in mathematics and economics. I had taken out loans for graduate school, earning a master's degree in data analytics while working part-time to minimize the debt I would carry afterward. I had accepted this position in Minneapolis, even though it meant moving away from everyone I knew, because I recognized it as an opportunity to build the kind of career that would provide long-term security. In the 3 years since joining Meridian, I had proven myself reliable, competent, and thorough. I met every deadline, exceeded performance targets, and earned consistent praise from Kenneth and other supervisors for the quality of my work. I had received raises each year and had been promoted once, from junior analyst to senior analyst, with the implicit understanding that continued strong performance could lead to team lead positions and eventually management roles if I wanted them. The work itself suited my strengths perfectly. I enjoyed the puzzle-like nature of data analysis, the satisfaction of finding patterns and insights hidden in columns of numbers. I appreciated that my recommendations, based on careful research and sound methodology, helped clients make better financial decisions. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing that my work had tangible value, that I was contributing something meaningful even if most people would never know my name or see the analysis behind the investment strategies they benefited from. My colleagues were pleasant enough, though I had not formed close friendships with any of them. We maintained professional relationships characterized by courtesy and collaboration, without extending into personal territory. I ate lunch at my desk most days, preferring to use the time productively rather than engaging in the social rituals of group lunches or break room conversations about television shows and weekend plans I had little interest in discussing. There was one colleague, however, who had made several attempts to develop a closer relationship despite my general preference for professional distance. His name was Derek Matheson, and he worked in the investment strategy division on the same floor as my department. Derek was 34, conventionally attractive with the kind of polished appearance and easy charm that seemed to make networking and relationship building effortless for him. He had joined Meridian about 18 months ago, transferring from a larger firm in Chicago, where he had apparently built an impressive reputation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Derek had first approached me about 6 months after his arrival, stopping by my desk one afternoon to ask questions about data I had compiled for a project his team was working on. The questions were legitimate and our conversation was professional, but I sensed even then that his interest extended beyond simple information gathering. In the weeks that followed, he found increasing reasons to stop by my workspace, to request my input on projects, to suggest we grab coffee to discuss work matters that could easily have been handled via email. I had maintained careful boundaries, keeping our interactions strictly professional despite his obvious attempts to make them personal. I was not interested in workplace romance, having seen too many situations where such relationships created complications and compromised careers, particularly for women who were often judged more harshly than their male counterparts when professional and personal boundaries blurred. Derek seemed to accept my boundaries with good humor, never pushing inappropriately but also never quite giving up his efforts to develop a warmer relationship than I was willing to offer. As I finally settled into bed that Monday night, I felt the pleasant tiredness that came from a productive day. My mind ran through the tasks awaiting me the next day. I would arrive early and work on the quarterly report during those quiet morning hours. I had a team meeting at 9:30 where we would discuss ongoing projects and distribute assignments. I had scheduled one-on-one time with Kenneth at 2 o'clock to provide a progress update on the report and discuss some questions I had about the scope of analysis he wanted included. The day would be busy but manageable, structured in the way I found most comfortable. I fell asleep easily, as I usually did, with no sense that the carefully ordered life I had built was about to be disrupted in ways I could never have anticipated. I had no premonition of the alarm that would jar me awake in the middle of the night, no instinct that warned me of the danger I was completely unaware I was in. I slept peacefully, secure in the routines and structures I had created, trusting in the stability I had worked so hard to establish. My alarm was set for 5 o'clock in the morning. I never reached it. At 4:53, according to the clock I would check later in my disoriented state, someone began pounding on my apartment door with desperate urgency. The sound penetrated my sleep gradually, incorporating itself into my dreams before finally pulling me into confused wakefulness. For several seconds I lay still, trying to determine if the noise was real or imagined, if I was actually awake or still caught in some strange dream. The pounding continued, insistent and alarming. Along with the physical percussion against my door, I could hear a voice calling my name with unmistakable panic. "Claire! Claire, wake up! You need to wake up right now." I recognized the voice even through the fog of interrupted sleep. It was Marcus Chun, my neighbor from apartment 304, directly across the hall from my own unit. Marcus was 42 years old, a software engineer who worked remotely for a tech company based in Seattle. We had been neighbors for 2 years, maintaining the cordial but not particularly close relationship typical of apartment dwellers. We exchanged greetings when we encountered each other in the hallway or parking lot. We had once helped each other by accepting package deliveries when the other was not home. We were friendly without being friends, our interactions pleasant but superficial. I had never heard Marcus sound the way he sounded now. His voice tight with fear and urgency that cut through my confusion, and sent adrenaline surging through my system. I threw off my blankets and stumbled to the door, grabbing my bathrobe from the hook beside my bedroom entrance and wrapping it around myself as I moved through the dark apartment. "I'm coming," I called out, my voice rough with sleep. "Hold on, I'm coming." I reached the door and looked through the peephole, confirming that it was indeed Marcus standing in the hallway. He looked disheveled, his hair uncombed and his eyes wide with something that looked like genuine terror. He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, clearly having dressed hastily without attention to appearance. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door, preparing to ask what emergency could possibly warrant this middle-of-the-night disturbance. Before I could speak, Marcus pushed forward with desperate energy. "You cannot go to work today," he said, his words tumbling out rapidly. "Claire, I know this sounds absolutely insane, but you cannot leave this building. You cannot get in your car. You cannot go to your office. Something terrible is going to happen and you need to stay home." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying, trying to determine if my neighbor had somehow developed a mental health crisis that required immediate intervention. He looked back at me with complete conviction despite the obvious awareness that he sounded irrational. "Marcus, what are you talking about? What is going on?" "I can't fully explain it right now," he said, his voice strained with the effort of trying to sound calm despite his obvious agitation. "I know you have absolutely no reason to trust what I'm telling you. I know this makes no sense. But I am begging you, please do not go to work today. Call in sick. Make up an excuse. Do whatever you need to do, but stay home." I looked at him more carefully, examining him for signs of intoxication or drug use that might explain his bizarre behavior. His eyes were clear despite the fear in them, his speech pattern urgent but coherent, his physical coordination normal. He did not appear to be under the influence of any substance. He simply appeared to be completely terrified about something he believed with absolute certainty. "You need to tell me what this is about," I said firmly, keeping my voice level despite the surreal nature of this conversation. "You cannot knock on my door in the middle of the night, tell me not to go to work, and then refuse to explain why." Marcus ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of profound frustration, struggling with some internal conflict I could not understand. "There is going to be an incident at your office building today," he finally said, each word seeming to cost him significant effort. "Something very bad. People are going to die, Claire. And if you go to work at your usual time, you will be one of them." The statement was so shocking, so completely unexpected, that I actually laughed, a short, startled sound that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with the absurdity of what I was hearing. "You're telling me there's going to be some kind of attack on my office building? And you know this how, exactly?" "I can't tell you how I know," Marcus said, and I could see genuine anguish in his expression. "I understand that makes this impossible for you to believe. I understand that everything about this situation sounds completely crazy, but I am telling you the absolute truth. If you leave for work at your normal time, you will not survive the day." We stood there in my doorway, me in my bathrobe with my mind still foggy from interrupted sleep, him in his hastily thrown-on clothes with terror etched across his features. The hallway was silent except for the distant hum of the building's heating system, and the muffled sound of early morning traffic from the street below. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh illumination that made the entire scene feel unreal, like something happening in a dream rather than actual waking life. I should have closed the door. I should have told Marcus he needed to leave and perhaps seek help for whatever was causing him to have what appeared to be a paranoid delusion. I should have dismissed his warning as the ramblings of someone experiencing a crisis and returned to bed to salvage what remained of my sleep before my alarm went off. Instead, something in his absolute conviction gave me pause. I had known Marcus for 2 years, and in all that time he had never displayed any behavior that suggested instability or irrationality. He was quiet, professional, considerate as a neighbor. He maintained his apartment well, never created disturbances, always showed courtesy in the common areas. Nothing in my previous experience with him suggested he was prone to flights of fancy or dramatic pronouncements, and the fear in his eyes was undeniably real. Whatever he believed was going to happen, he believed it with absolute certainty. He was not trying to play a prank or get attention. He was genuinely terrified, and that terror was specifically focused on protecting me from something he believed represented a deadly threat. "Give me your phone number," I heard myself say, the words coming out before I had fully decided on a course of action. "Go back to your apartment. I'm going to stay home this morning. At noon, you are going to explain to me exactly what this is about and how you know what you claim to know. If you cannot provide a satisfactory explanation, I'm going to report this incident to the building management and possibly to the police. Do you understand?" Relief flooded Marcus's features so intensely that I actually felt my resolve weaken, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake by taking this seriously even provisionally. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying home. At noon, I promise you will understand everything." He gave me his phone number, which I entered into my phone with hands that trembled slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through my system. We stood there for another moment, the weight of this strange interaction hanging between us. Then Marcus turned and walked back to his apartment across the hall, looking back once with an expression I could not quite read before disappearing inside. I closed my door and locked it, standing in my darkened living room trying to process what had just happened. Outside my windows, the city was still mostly dark, the sky holding that deep black-blue color that comes in the hour before dawn. I looked at my phone. It was 5:07 in the morning. My alarm would have gone off in approximately 8 minutes. Instead of my usual morning routine of immediate productivity and efficient preparation, I was standing in my bathrobe trying to decide if I had just been manipulated by a skilled con artist, threatened by a dangerous person, or warned by someone who somehow possessed genuine foreknowledge of a coming disaster. The rational part of my mind insisted this was absurd, that I should ignore Marcus's warning and proceed with my day as planned. There was no logical reason to believe that my neighbor possessed psychic abilities or insider knowledge of some planned attack. The chances that any of this was real were infinitesimally small. I would be jeopardizing my professional reputation by calling in sick on a day when I had important work to complete, and I would be doing so based on nothing more than the middle-of-the-night panic of a man I barely knew. But another part of me, a part one did not fully understand, could not dismiss what had just happened. The intensity of Marcus's conviction had been palpable and disturbing, and there was something else, something I could not quite articulate, that made me hesitate to simply dismiss his warning as nonsense. I walked to my kitchen and turned on the light, wincing at the brightness after the darkness of my apartment. I filled the electric kettle with water and turned it on, deciding that if I was going to be awake at this absurd hour, I might as well make tea and think through my options rationally. While the water heated, I checked my phone for news, searching for any reports of threats against downtown Minneapolis buildings or businesses. I found nothing unusual, just the typical mix of local news stories about city council meetings, weather forecasts predicting an early winter storm later in the week, and sports coverage of the Vikings' recent game. There was nothing that suggested any kind of emergency or danger. I composed a text message to Kenneth, my supervisor, informing him that I was feeling unwell and would be working from home today. I hesitated before sending it, my finger hovering over the send button as I wrestled with the decision. Taking a sick day would not be a disaster for my career, but it would be inconvenient and would require me to work harder later in the week to stay on schedule with my deliverables. It would also mean admitting to myself that I was taking seriously the warning of a man whose credibility I had no reason to trust. But the alternative, if Marcus was somehow correct, was unthinkable. If there truly was going to be some kind of incident at my office building, if people were genuinely going to die, then my professional reputation and my quarterly report deadline suddenly seemed magnificently unimportant. I pressed send before I could talk myself out of it. The tea kettle clicked off, and I poured hot water over a chamomile tea bag, watching the water slowly transform from clear to pale golden. I carried the mug to my living room and sat on my couch, pulling a blanket over my legs as I tried to settle my racing thoughts. The apartment was silent except for the ticking of the clock on my wall, each second passing with deliberate precision. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the deep night slowly surrendering to the gray dawn of an October morning. I sat there wrapped in my blanket, drinking tea that tasted of nothing despite being one of my favorite flavors, and waited for noon to arrive so Marcus could explain what he knew and how he knew it, and whether I had just made the wisest decision of my life or the most foolish one. The hours between 5 in the morning and noon stretched before me with agonizing slowness, each minute feeling like it contained triple its normal allocation of seconds. I sat on my couch in the gradually brightening living room, my untouched tea growing cold in the mug I held between both hands, and tried to make sense of what had just happened and what I should do next. At 5:30, I forced myself to move from the couch and begin some semblance of a normal morning routine, though nothing about this morning felt normal. I took a shower, hoping the hot water and familiar ritual would help organize my scattered thoughts. Instead, I found myself standing under the spray replaying Marcus's words over and over, analyzing his tone and expression for clues about whether he was genuinely trying to protect me or manipulating me for reasons I could not fathom. The rational explanations for his behavior seemed limited and unsatisfying. He could be experiencing a mental health crisis involving paranoid delusions about threats that existed only in his mind. He could be attempting some kind of elaborate prank or social experiment, though the fear in his eyes had seemed far too authentic for performance. He could be involved in something criminal and trying to keep me away from the office for reasons connected to whatever illegal activity he was participating in. Or, impossibly, he could be telling the truth about having genuine foreknowledge of a coming disaster. None of these possibilities provided comfort or clarity. I dressed in comfortable clothes rather than my planned work outfit, the soft fabric of worn jeans and a sweater feeling appropriate for a day that had already veered so far from normal expectations. I made coffee despite having little appetite for it, going through the motions because the routine itself was soothing even when the result held no appeal. At 6:15, the time I would normally be arriving at my office to begin my productive early morning work hours, I instead sat at my small dining table with my laptop open, staring at the email from Kenneth that had arrived in response to my message about working from home. He had replied with his typical efficiency, acknowledging my message and noting that I should email him any questions about the quarterly report rather than waiting for our scheduled 2 o'clock meeting. The tone was professional and unsuspicious, containing no indication that he doubted my claim of illness or resented the inconvenience of my absence. I should have felt relieved that calling in sick had been so straightforward and consequence-free. Instead, I felt a growing sense of unreality, as if I were watching myself from outside my own body, observing a woman who had made a bizarre decision based on inadequate information, and was now committed to seeing that decision through to whatever conclusion awaited. I opened the files for my quarterly report, thinking that if I was working from home I should at least accomplish something productive. The familiar spreadsheets and analysis documents appeared on my screen exactly as I had left them the night before, when my biggest concern had been ensuring that every data point was properly verified and every recommendation thoroughly supported by evidence. I stared at the columns of numbers and percentages, trying to focus my attention on identifying patterns and drawing conclusions, but my mind refused to engage with the material in any meaningful way. At 7 o'clock, I gave up pretending I could work, and instead turned my attention to news websites and social media, searching obsessively for any information about threats or incidents in downtown Minneapolis. I checked the websites of local television stations, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and various neighborhood forums and community pages. I found nothing alarming, nothing that suggested any kind of emergency or danger. The city appeared to be experiencing a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, with the usual traffic reports about congestion on Interstate 94 and weather updates about the approaching cold front. I considered calling the police to report Marcus's warning, but immediately recognized the problem with that approach. What exactly would I tell them? My neighbor knocked on my door before dawn and told me not to go to work because something bad was going to happen, but he refused to explain how he knew or provide any specific details about the nature of the threat. Even as I imagined making that call, I could hear how it would sound to the person on the other end of the line, could anticipate their barely concealed skepticism as they tried to determine if this report warranted any response beyond a note in some database that would never be reviewed. And there was another consideration that kept me from making that call. If Marcus was telling the truth, if he somehow did possess genuine information about a coming threat, then reporting him to authorities might interfere with whatever he knew or whatever he was trying to prevent. The complexity of not knowing whether he was a danger or a protector paralyzed me, leaving me unable to take any decisive action beyond the one I had already taken by staying home. At 8 o'clock my phone rang. The caller ID showed the main number for Meridian Financial Services. My stomach clenched as I answered, wondering if Kenneth had somehow detected something suspicious about my absence and was calling to question me more directly. Instead, the voice on the other end belonged to Jennifer Hastings, one of my colleagues in the data analytics department. Jennifer was 27, relatively new to the company, and someone I had helped train when she first joined our team 18 months ago. We had a friendly working relationship characterized by mutual professional respect, though like most of my workplace connections, it had never extended beyond the office into personal friendship. "Claire, I am so sorry to bother you when you are not feeling well," Jennifer began, her voice carrying genuine concern mixed with obvious stress. "But I have run into a major problem with the Henderson portfolio analysis, and you are the only person who understands the methodology well enough to help me figure out what is going wrong. I know you are sick, and I feel terrible asking, but could you possibly spare 15 minutes to walk me through the calculations? I have been trying to resolve this since 6:30 this morning and I am completely stuck." Relief flooded through me so intensely that I felt momentarily lightheaded. This was normal, this was familiar, this was the kind of work problem that I knew how to solve. I spent the next 20 minutes on the phone with Jennifer, talking her through the complex calculations she was struggling with, identifying where her approach had deviated from the correct methodology, and explaining the underlying logic that would allow her to complete the analysis successfully. As we worked through the problem together, I felt my anxiety begin to ease slightly. The intellectual engagement required to diagnose her issue and explain the solution occupied my mind in a way that pushed aside the chaotic speculation about Marcus and his warning. By the time we concluded the call with Jennifer's grateful thanks and promises that she would not bother me again, unless absolutely necessary, I felt more grounded and less like I was trapped in some bizarre alternate reality. I made myself a proper breakfast, scrambling eggs and toasting bread with deliberate attention to the process, focusing on the simple physical tasks of cooking and eating. The food tasted better than the tea had, and I recognized that my body needed fuel even if my mind was too preoccupied to generate appropriate hunger signals. I ate slowly, chewing thoroughly, trying to be present in the moment rather than constantly projecting forward to noon when Marcus would provide his explanation. At 9:15, my phone buzzed with a text message from Derek Matheson. The message was brief and casual, asking if I was feeling okay and offering to bring me soup or anything else I might need. The gesture was thoughtful, exactly the kind of considerate behavior Derek consistently demonstrated, and yet something about receiving it this morning felt intrusive in a way I could not quite articulate. I replied with equal brevity, thanking him for his concern and assuring him that I simply needed rest and would be back in the office tomorrow. I kept my response polite but cool, maintaining the professional boundaries I had worked to establish over the months of his persistent attempts to develop a warmer relationship. He responded with a simple acknowledgement and a cheerful emoji that somehow irritated me despite its innocuousness. The morning continued its slow progression toward noon. I attempted to work on my quarterly report and managed to make minor edits to a few sections, though I knew the quality of my analysis was compromised by my inability to fully concentrate. I checked news websites every 15 minutes, the compulsive behavior accomplishing nothing except to confirm that nothing newsworthy was happening in downtown Minneapolis. I made more tea that I did not drink. I stood at my window looking out over the neighborhood, watching people walk to their cars and drive away to their jobs, living ordinary Tuesday mornings unmarked by strange warnings from neighbors who claimed to possess impossible knowledge. At 10:45, unable to tolerate the waiting any longer, I texted Marcus asking if we could meet earlier than noon. His response came within seconds, a simple message saying that noon was necessary and asking me to please wait just a little longer. The phrasing of his request, the implicit urgency behind the words "please wait," sent fresh anxiety coursing through me. I paced my apartment, moving from room to room without purpose, picking up objects and setting them down, straightening things that were already straight. The nervous energy had nowhere to go, no productive outlet, no way to discharge itself through action when I did not know what action would be appropriate. I considered going for a run or doing some kind of vigorous exercise, but the idea of leaving my apartment even briefly felt wrong, as if staying within these walls was somehow essential to my safety even though that made no logical sense. At 11:30, I heard sirens in the distance. The sound was not unusual in an urban environment, where emergency vehicles were a regular feature of the auditory landscape. But today, in my heightened state of anxiety and hypervigilance, the sirens made my heart rate spike and my breath catch in my throat. I rushed to my window, straining to see in the direction the sound was coming from, trying to determine if the emergency was nearby or distant, if it was moving closer or away. The sirens faded without ever revealing their source or destination. I stood at the window for several more minutes, scanning the visible streets for any sign of crisis or unusual activity. Everything appeared completely normal. A woman walked past pushing a stroller. A delivery truck pulled up to the building across the street, and a uniformed driver began unloading packages. 2 teenagers waited at the bus stop, their faces illuminated by their phones. Ordinary life proceeding with complete indifference to my inner turmoil. At 11:55, I could wait no longer. I left my apartment and walked across the hallway to Marcus's door, raising my hand to knock. Before my knuckles could make contact with the wood, the door opened and Marcus stood there looking as exhausted and strained as I felt. "Come in," he said quietly, stepping back to allow me entry into his apartment. I had never been inside Marcus's unit before, and I registered the space with the automatic attention to detail that characterized my analytical nature. The layout was identical to my own apartment, a mirror image with the same basic floor plan but decorated and furnished completely differently. Where my space was minimalist and organized, Marcus's apartment was cluttered with technology equipment, books stacked on every available surface, and whiteboards covered with diagrams and equations I could not begin to understand. Multiple computer monitors glowed on a large desk that dominated the living room, displaying what appeared to be complex data visualizations and scrolling code. Marcus gestured toward his couch, and I sat down on the edge of the cushion, too tense to settle back into a relaxed posture. He remained standing, running his hands through his hair in the same gesture of frustration I had observed earlier that morning. For a long moment we simply looked at each other, the weight of everything unspoken hanging in the air between us. "Before I explain," Marcus finally said, his voice low and careful, "I need you to understand that what I am about to tell you will sound completely insane. I need you to listen all the way through before you react or decide that I am crazy and need professional help. Can you do that?" "I stayed home from work based on your warning," I pointed out, my tone sharper than I intended. "I think I have already demonstrated a willingness to consider information that sounds unreasonable. Tell me what you know and how you know it." Marcus walked to his desk and picked up a tablet, his fingers moving across the screen as he pulled up something he wanted to show me. He returned to where I sat and handed me the device. On the screen was a news article from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune website. The headline read, "Explosion at Downtown Office Building Kills 12, Injures Dozens." I stared at the headline, trying to process what I was seeing. The article was dated today, Tuesday, October 24th, but the timestamp showed it had been published at 1:15 in the afternoon. It was not quite noon yet. This article was reporting on something that had not happened yet. "How did you create this?" I asked, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "This is obviously fabricated. You made a fake news article to convince me of something, but I do not understand why or what you expect to accomplish." "It is not fabricated," Marcus said, and there was such profound weariness in his voice that I looked up from the tablet to his face. "That article is real. It will be published in approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. I know this because I have already lived through this day before. This is not the first time I have experienced October 24th. This is the 7th time." The words hung in the air between us, so completely absurd that I actually felt a hysterical laugh building in my chest. But the expression on Marcus's face stopped the laugh before it could emerge. He was not joking. He was not performing or trying to create dramatic effect. He was stating what he believed to be a simple fact, however impossible that fact might be. "You are telling me you are caught in some kind of time loop," I said slowly, working to keep my voice level and calm. "Like a science fiction movie premise. You are experiencing the same day over and over." "I know how it sounds," Marcus said, sitting down heavily in the chair across from me. "I know exactly how insane this is. But yes, that is what I am telling you. I have lived through this specific day 7 times now. The first 6 times, I watched the news reports about the explosion at the Meridian Financial Services building. I saw the names of the victims. Your name was on that list, Claire. You died in your office at approximately 12:45 when a bomb exploded on the 18th floor of your building." My hands had gone numb. I realized I was gripping the tablet so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. I forced myself to relax my fingers, to breathe, to process what Marcus was claiming without immediately dismissing it as delusion or fabrication. Why is this happening? I heard myself ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Why are you caught in a loop, and how do you know that preventing me from going to work will change anything? I do not know why it is happening, Marcus admitted, and I could hear the frustration and fear underlying his words. I woke up 7 days ago on what I thought was October 24th, and I lived through a normal day. I worked, I ate dinner, I went to bed. Then I woke up and it was October 24th again. Same day, same date, everything reset. The first few times I thought I was losing my mind. I tried everything to prove I was wrong, to find some explanation that made sense. But every night when I go to sleep, I wake up and it is October 24th again, and everything starts over. He stood up and began pacing, his movements agitated and jerky. The first 2 times I did not know about the explosion until after it happened. I saw the news reports, the emergency response, the victim names released that evening. The 3rd time through, I tried to warn the authorities to report the threat before it happened. They did not believe me. They could not believe me because I had no evidence and no credible explanation for how I knew. The bomb still went off. You still died. The 4th time I tried to warn you directly, but I did it wrong. I approached you at your office building in the morning before the explosion, and you thought I was threatening you. You reported me to building security, and they removed me. The explosion happened anyway. The 5th time I tried calling in a bomb threat myself, thinking that would trigger an evacuation. The building was evacuated but not completely and not in time. You were still in the building when it exploded because you refused to leave until you had saved your work files. Marcus stopped pacing and looked directly at me, his eyes reflecting depths of exhaustion and trauma that I could not fully comprehend. The 6th time I tried to physically stop you from entering the building. I waited outside and tried to pull you away from the entrance. You fought me off and called for help. I was arrested, and while I was being held by security, the explosion happened and you died again. This is the 7th time. I decided the only approach that might work was to convince you to stay home entirely, to keep you away from that building before the day even really started. So I woke you up before dawn and begged you to trust me without being able to explain why. I sat in silence, trying to evaluate whether anything he was saying could possibly be true, or whether I was listening to an elaborately constructed delusion born from serious mental illness. The tablet in my hands felt heavy with impossible weight. The fake news article displaying information that could not exist yet. Prove it, I said finally. If you have lived through this day 7 times, you know what is going to happen. Tell me something specific that will occur in the next hour. Something you could not possibly know unless you had actually experienced it before. Marcus nodded as if he had been expecting this challenge. At 12:17, your mother is going to call you. She is going to tell you that your father had a minor health scare this morning, chest pains that turned out to be indigestion rather than a heart attack, but they went to the emergency room to be safe. She will apologize for not calling earlier but will explain that she did not want to worry you while they were still waiting for test results. She will ask if you can visit them this weekend because your father has been talking about wanting to see you more often. I stared at Marcus, my mind racing. My parents lived in Duluth, about 2.5 hours north of Minneapolis. My relationship with them was affectionate but not particularly close, characterized by phone calls every couple of weeks and visits a few times a year. My father was 63 and had struggled with high blood pressure and borderline cholesterol levels. Health issues he managed through medication, but that created ongoing concern. The scenario Marcus described was plausible, but it was also specific enough that he could not simply be making an educated guess. At 12:31, Marcus continued, you will receive an email from Kenneth Brennan telling you that the 2 o'clock meeting you had scheduled is canceled because something urgent has come up that requires his immediate attention. He will not provide details in the email, and you will never find out what that urgent matter was because at 12:45 the building will explode and Kenneth will be among those killed. At 12:38, Jennifer Hastings will text you thanking you again for your help this morning and telling you that she successfully completed the Henderson portfolio analysis. She will include 2 thumbs up emojis and a smiley face. She will be in the break room getting coffee when the bomb goes off. She will survive the initial blast but will be critically injured by falling debris. She will die in the hospital 3 days later. Marcus's voice had gone flat and mechanical, as if he were reciting information he had memorized through painful repetition. At 12:43, you will receive a calendar notification reminding you about a dentist appointment scheduled for next week. At 12:45, the explosion will occur. Within minutes, every major news outlet in the city will begin reporting on the incident. By 1:15, the article you are holding will be published with preliminary information about casualties. By this evening, they will have confirmed 12 deaths and 43 injuries. Your name will be on the list of fatalities. I looked down at the tablet again, at the impossible article reporting on an event that had not yet occurred. My mind was struggling to process the implications of what Marcus was claiming, the sheer impossibility of time loops and repeated days warring with the specific details he was providing and the genuine anguish in his voice as he described watching people die over and over. Why would someone bomb the Meridian building? I asked, grasping for some logical thread to follow through this maze of impossibility. Is it terrorism? Workplace violence? What is the motive? I do not know the complete details, Marcus said, sitting down again as if the effort of standing had become too much. From the news reports across multiple iterations, what I have pieced together is that a former employee who was fired 6 months ago for embezzlement planted the bomb as revenge. His name is Thomas Vega. He worked in the accounting department on the 18th floor, the same floor where your office is located. He blamed the company for destroying his life when they pressed charges against him, and he spent 6 months planning his retaliation. The name meant nothing to me. I had vague awareness that someone in accounting had been terminated for financial misconduct earlier in the year, but I had not known any details and had paid little attention to office gossip about the situation. The idea that this person I had never met had planted a bomb that would kill me and 11 other people felt surreal and disconnected from anything resembling my actual life. The explosion occurs at 12:45 because that is when the greatest number of people are in the building, Marcus continued. Most employees are back from lunch breaks but have not yet gone into afternoon meetings. The bomb is sophisticated enough to cause structural damage to multiple floors. The death toll would be higher except that it is located on the 18th floor rather than a lower level, so the blast is partially contained by the floors above and below. He paused, his expression haunted. I have watched this happen 6 times, Claire. I have seen the news footage of the burning building, the emergency responders pulling bodies from the rubble, the press conferences where company executives express shock and grief. I have read your obituary. I have watched your parents on the local news being interviewed about their loss. Every night I go to sleep thinking maybe this time I have changed enough that the loop will break and I will wake up to October 25th. And every morning I open my eyes and it is October 24th again. And I know I have one more chance to try to stop this. We sat in silence, the weight of his words filling the cluttered apartment. Outside the windows, the city continued its normal operations, people going about their Tuesday activities with no awareness that, according to the man sitting across from me, a bomb was going to explode in approximately 45 minutes and 12 people were going to die. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with hands that trembled slightly. The screen showed an incoming call from Mom. I looked at the clock on Marcus's wall. It was 12:17 exactly. I answered my mother's call with a sense of unreality so profound that I felt disconnected from my own body, as if I were watching someone else lift the phone to their ear and speak the greeting that came automatically from years of habit. "Hi, Mom," I said, my voice sounding remarkably steady despite the chaos of thoughts swirling through my mind. "Claire, sweetheart, I am so sorry I did not call you earlier this morning," my mother began, and I could hear the strain in her voice that came from hours of worry followed by relief. "Your father had a health scare this morning. He woke up with chest pains and we went to the emergency room because you know how his heart has been a concern with his blood pressure issues. We have been here since 6:30 this morning waiting for test results." I was staring at Marcus as my mother spoke, watching his expression remain carefully neutral, giving nothing away but also not showing any surprise at what was clearly confirming exactly what he had predicted would happen at this precise time. The apartment felt too small suddenly, the air too thick, as if reality itself had become unstable, and I was caught in the moment of its transformation into something fundamentally different. "Is Dad okay?" I managed to ask, forcing myself to focus on my mother's words rather than the impossible implications of Marcus having known she would call at 12:17 with this specific information. "He is fine, thank God," my mother said, and I could hear the exhaustion and relief mixing in her voice. It turned out to be severe indigestion, not his heart at all. They ran all the tests to be absolutely certain, and his heart is actually in better shape than the last time he had a checkup. But it was terrifying this morning, Claire. When he described the pain, I was convinced we were dealing with a heart attack. I have never been so scared in my life. My mother continued talking, providing details about the emergency room experience, the tests they had run, the young doctor who had been so thorough and reassuring. I responded with appropriate sounds of concern and relief, playing my part in this conversation while my mind raced ahead to what Marcus had predicted would happen next. He had said she would ask about visiting this weekend, that my father had been talking about wanting to see me more often. Your father has been talking all morning about how we do not see you enough, my mother said, and my stomach clenched at the words that matched Marcus's prediction with unsettling precision. This scare really put things in perspective for him. He kept saying that if something had happened to him, his biggest regret would be not spending more time with you. I know you are busy with your career and your life in Minneapolis, but do you think you could come visit us this weekend? It would mean so much to your father, and honestly it would mean a lot to me too. Of course I can come visit, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Let me check my calendar and figure out the best time to drive up. I'm so glad Dad is okay, Mom. Give him my love and tell him I will call him later today. We concluded the conversation with the usual expressions of affection and promises to coordinate details later. I ended the call and set my phone down on the coffee table with exaggerated care, as if the device might shatter if I moved too quickly. The silence in Marcus's apartment felt heavy and charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm when the air pressure changes and you can sense something coming even before the first drops of rain fall. You knew, I said, the words coming out flat and stunned. You knew exactly what she would say and exactly when she would call. That is not something you could have guessed or fabricated. There is no way you could have known about my father's health scare this morning, unless you actually experienced this day before. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression showing no triumph or satisfaction at being proven correct, only a profound weariness that spoke of battles fought repeatedly without victory. I have had that same conversation with you 6 times before, he said quietly. The first time I did not pay much attention to it because I was focused on the news about the explosion. But in subsequent loops I started keeping detailed notes about everything that happens throughout the day, every phone call, every email, every small event. I needed to find something I could tell you that would make you believe me without sounding so impossible that you would dismiss everything I said as delusion. I stood up from the couch and walked to the windows of Marcus's apartment, looking out at the street below where ordinary life continued its ordinary progression. A woman was loading groceries into the trunk of her car. A jogger ran past with earbuds in and a determined expression. 2 construction workers sat on the edge of a building foundation, eating their lunch from metal containers. The world appeared completely normal, completely stable, completely unaware that if Marcus was telling the truth, then in approximately 28 minutes a bomb would explode less than 3 miles from here and 12 people would die. I need to call the police, I said, turning back to face Marcus. If what you are saying is true, if there really is a bomb in my office building, then we need to warn someone who can actually do something about it. We need to trigger an evacuation, get people out of that building before 12:45. I have tried that, Marcus said, and there was such defeat in his voice that I felt a chill run down my spine. On the 3rd iteration of this day, I called in a bomb threat at 11 in the morning. The building was partially evacuated, but the process was chaotic and not everyone got out in time. Some people stayed to gather important materials. Some people did not take the threat seriously. The bomb still went off. People still died. You were one of them because you refused to leave until you had backed up all your files to the company's server. On the 4th iteration, I went directly to the police with everything I knew about when and where the bomb would explode. They took a report but could not act on it because I had no credible evidence and no way to explain how I knew. They sent a patrol car to drive by the building, but they did not conduct a search or force an evacuation based solely on the statement of someone claiming to have premonition of a future attack. The explosion happened on schedule. Marcus stood up and walked to his desk, pulling open a drawer and removing a thick notebook filled with dense handwriting. He held it up for me to see. This is my record of 6 iterations of October 24th. Every detail I could remember about what happened and when. Every attempt I made to change the outcome. Every failure. I have tried warning the police, warning building security, warning random people on the street. I have tried physically stopping people from entering the building. Nothing has worked. The bomb always goes off at 12:45. The same 12 people always die, with minor variations in which additional people are injured depending on exactly where they are when the explosion occurs. He set the notebook down on the coffee table between us and opened it to a page covered with names and timestamps. I could see my own name written there multiple times, along with notations about when I typically arrived at work, where my office was located, what I was usually doing at the time of the explosion. The level of detail was simultaneously reassuring in its specificity and deeply disturbing in its implications. Why do you think keeping me away from the building today will be different? I asked, trying to understand the logic of his approach. If you have tried so many other interventions and none of them worked, what makes you believe that preventing me specifically from being there will change anything? Because you are the one thing that has been consistent across every iteration, Marcus said, and there was something in his voice I could not quite identify, an intensity that went beyond simple desperation to save a life. Every time I have lived this day, you have died in that explosion. I have tried saving other people, I have tried warning everyone I could reach, but nothing has broken the loop. So this time I decided to focus entirely on one person. I decided that if I could keep you safe, if I could ensure that you survived October 24th, maybe that would be enough to break whatever pattern is keeping me trapped. The implication of his words settled over me slowly. You think I am somehow central to the time loop? You think the universe or fate or whatever is causing this is focused on me specifically? I do not know what to think, Marcus admitted, running his hands through his hair in that gesture of frustration I was beginning to recognize as habitual. I do not understand why this is happening or what the rules are or how to escape it. All I know is that I have watched you die 6 times, and I cannot stand to watch it happen again. So yes, I am focusing everything on keeping you alive, because that is the one variable I have not successfully changed across all the previous iterations. My phone buzzed with an incoming email notification. I picked it up and saw that the message was from Kenneth Brennan. The subject line read, "Meeting cancellation." My hands felt cold as I opened the email and read the brief message informing me that our scheduled 2 o'clock meeting needed to be canceled due to an urgent matter that required his immediate attention, and that we would reschedule for later in the week. The timestamp on the email showed it had been sent at 12:31. I looked at the clock on Marcus's wall. It was 12:32. He is canceling the meeting we were supposed to have this afternoon, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Just like you said he would. At exactly the time you predicted. Marcus simply nodded, no satisfaction in the gesture, only acknowledgement of another piece of evidence falling into place exactly as he had described it would. The weight of accumulated proof was becoming impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. Individual elements could potentially be coincidence or lucky guessing, but the precise accuracy of multiple specific predictions, occurring at exact times he had specified, was moving beyond the realm of chance into something that demanded acceptance, however impossible it seemed. What else is going to happen in the next few minutes? I asked, needing to test this further, needing to push the boundaries of what Marcus claimed to know. At 12:38, Jennifer will text you thanking you for your help this morning, Marcus said, his voice taking on that flat, mechanical quality again as he recited information he had memorized through painful repetition. She will say that she successfully completed the Henderson portfolio analysis. She will include 2 thumbs-up emojis and a smiley face. At 12:43, you will receive a calendar notification about your dentist appointment next week. At 12:45, the explosion will occur. We waited in tense silence, watching the minutes advance on the clock with agonizing slowness. I found myself holding my breath as 12:38 approached, my entire body rigid with anticipation and dread. When my phone buzzed at exactly 12:38, I jumped despite having expected it. The text message was from Jennifer Hastings. Thank you so much for your help this morning. I successfully completed the Henderson portfolio analysis thanks to your guidance. The message was followed by 2 thumbs-up emojis and a smiley face, exactly as Marcus had described. Something inside me shifted at that moment, some fundamental resistance giving way in the face of evidence that could no longer be rationally dismissed. Marcus was telling the truth. He had lived through this day before, multiple times, and everything he predicted was coming true with precision that transcended any possibility of coincidence or deception. "She is going to die," I said, looking at the cheerful emojis on my phone screen. "Jennifer is 27 years old. She is engaged to a man named David who works in pharmaceutical sales. They are planning a wedding for next summer. She talks about the venue they booked and the ongoing debates about the guest list and whether to have a band or a DJ. She has her whole life ahead of her. And in 7 minutes she is going to be in the break room getting coffee when a bomb explodes, and she is going to be critically injured and die 3 days later in the hospital." Marcus's face showed the toll of carrying knowledge about deaths he had witnessed repeatedly but been unable to prevent. "I know," he said quietly. "I know about Jennifer's wedding plans. I know about Kenneth's 2 daughters who are in high school. I know about David Chun, who works in IT and coaches youth basketball on weekends. I know about Patricia Sanders, who is 3 weeks away from retirement after 40 years with the company. I know their names and their stories because I have read their obituaries and watched their families grieve in news interviews. I know exactly who is going to die, and I have tried everything I can think of to save them." "We have to try again," I said, feeling urgency rising in my chest like a physical pressure. "We cannot just sit here knowing what is going to happen and do nothing. Even if your previous attempts failed, we have to try something. We have to warn someone, evacuate the building, call in a threat, something. If I call in a bomb threat now at 12:39, the authorities will not have time to respond effectively before the explosion occurs at 12:45, Marcus said, and I could hear the frustration of someone who had already exhausted every option he could imagine. 6 minutes is not enough time to evacuate an 18-story building, organize emergency response, and locate a bomb that is hidden somewhere on the 18th floor. The best-case scenario is that some people get out, but many will still be in the building when it explodes. But some people getting out is better than no one getting out, I argued, pulling up the emergency number on my phone. If we can save even one person beyond myself, that has to be worth trying. Marcus looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, some decision being made. "Okay," he said finally. "Call it in. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe having you involved directly instead of trying to do everything myself will change the outcome. I do not know anymore. I just know I have to keep trying." I dialed the emergency number with hands that shook slightly despite my efforts to remain calm and focused. When the operator answered, I forced my voice into steadiness and said that I had information about a bomb threat at the Meridian Financial Services building in downtown Minneapolis, that the device was located on the 18th floor, and that it was set to detonate at 12:45. The operator's response was professional and practiced, asking for my name and location, asking how I knew about this threat, asking for any additional details I could provide. I gave my name and explained that I was an employee of Meridian, who had received credible information about the threat from a source I could not fully identify. The operator informed me that emergency services were being dispatched immediately and asked me to remain on the line. Through the phone, I could hear the operator relaying information to other personnel, could hear the sudden urgency in voices in the background as the response protocol activated. Marcus had pulled out his laptop and was monitoring local emergency service communications through what appeared to be some kind of scanner application. I could hear the crackle of radio traffic as police and fire units began responding to the threat. "Multiple units are being dispatched," Marcus said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Police, fire department, bomb squad." The response is faster than previous iterations, probably because the call came from an actual employee of the company, rather than an anonymous tip or someone with no connection to the target. That might make a difference. My calendar notification buzzed at 12:43, exactly as Marcus had predicted, reminding me about a dentist appointment scheduled for the following week. The mundane nature of the reminder felt surreal given the circumstances, a small piece of normal life intruding on a situation that had moved far beyond anything resembling normality. 2 minutes, Marcus said, his voice tight with tension. In 2 minutes, if nothing has changed, the bomb will detonate regardless of whether emergency services have arrived or evacuation has begun. I moved to Marcus's window, straining to see in the direction of downtown even though the Meridian building was not visible from this location due to distance and intervening structures. The sky above the city remained clear and undisturbed, Ordinary clouds drifting across ordinary blue expanse. Traffic moved normally on the visible streets. The world appeared completely unchanged, completely unaware of what Marcus claimed was about to happen. 12:44, Marcus said, his eyes moving between the clock on his wall and the laptop screen showing emergency service communications. Police units are still en route. Fire department is 3 blocks away. Building security has initiated evacuation protocols, but the process has only just begun. Most people are still inside. I realized I was holding my breath, my entire body tense with anticipation and fear. Part of me wanted Marcus to be wrong, wanted his impossible story about time loops and repeated days to be delusion after all, wanted this entire situation to be some kind of elaborate breakdown rather than genuine foreknowledge of coming disaster. But a larger part of me, the part that had been convinced by the accumulated evidence of the morning, knew that he was telling the truth and that somewhere 3 miles away a bomb was about to explode. 12:45, Marcus said quietly. We waited in silence that stretched for seconds that felt like hours. Nothing happened. The clock advanced to 12:46, then 12:47. No sound of explosion reached us. No sirens suddenly intensified in the way they would if a major disaster had just occurred. The emergency service radio traffic continued its urgent, but controlled communication about responding units and evacuation procedures. But there was no sudden shift to crisis management that would indicate actual detonation. At 12:50, Marcus looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Nothing happened, he said, and there was something like wonder in his voice mixed with confusion and disbelief. The bomb did not go off. In every previous iteration, by 12:50, the explosion had occurred and emergency services were responding to mass casualties. But this time nothing happened. My phone rang, startling both of us. The caller ID showed it was from Meridian Financial Services, from the main office number. I answered with a sense of surreal detachment from the entire situation. Claire, this is Patricia Sanders from Human Resources, the voice on the other end said, and I recognized the name from Marcus's earlier recitation of people who would have died in the explosion. I am calling to inform you that the office building has been evacuated due to a bomb threat that was called in this afternoon. All employees are being sent home for the remainder of the day, while authorities conduct a thorough search of the premises. You do not need to worry about coming in tomorrow either, as we expect the investigation to continue through at least Wednesday. We will send out an email update this evening with more information about when normal operations will resume. Has anyone been hurt? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady given the chaos of emotions I was experiencing. No, thank goodness, Patricia said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. The evacuation was orderly and everyone got out safely. It was frightening, but no one was injured. Please check your email regularly for updates, and feel free to call if you have any questions or concerns. I ended the call and looked at Marcus, who had been monitoring my side of the conversation with intense focus. The building was evacuated, I said slowly, trying to process the implications. No one was hurt. They are conducting a search, but as of right now, nothing has exploded and no one has been injured. Marcus sat down heavily on his couch, his expression showing the emotional impact of this development. This is different, he said quietly. This has never happened before. In every previous iteration, the bomb detonated at 12:45 regardless of what interventions I attempted. But this time it did not go off. Something changed. Something is actually different. We sat together in his cluttered apartment, surrounded by the technology and notes that represented his desperate attempts to break the cycle he had been trapped in, and watched the minutes continue advancing past the time when disaster should have struck. My phone buzzed repeatedly with incoming messages from colleagues who had been in the building during the evacuation, sharing their experiences and expressing relief that everyone had gotten out safely. Each message was evidence that people who should have been injured or killed were instead simply shaken but alive. At 1:15, I pulled up the Minneapolis Star-Tribune website on my phone, remembering the article Marcus had shown me earlier that morning. The website showed normal news coverage of ordinary events. There was no headline about an explosion. There was no article about casualties. The news that should have existed, that Marcus had shown me from previous iterations of this day, simply was not there. It did not happen, I said, looking at Marcus with a mixture of relief and continuing confusion. The explosion did not occur. The people who were supposed to die are alive. You broke the pattern. Whatever you did by keeping me away from the building and having me call in the threat as an actual employee rather than an anonymous source, it worked. You changed the outcome." Marcus was staring at his hands, his expression showing the emotional toll of everything he had been through. "I do not know if it worked permanently," he said quietly. "I will not know if the loop is actually broken until I go to sleep tonight and see what day I wake up to tomorrow morning. Every other time I thought maybe I had changed enough to make a difference, and every morning I woke up to October 24th again. But this time feels different. The bomb did not go off. That has never happened before across 6 previous iterations. Something fundamental changed." "What do we do now?" I asked, feeling unmoored and uncertain about how to proceed in a situation that had moved so far beyond anything in my normal experience. "We wait," Marcus said. "We go through the rest of today as normally as possible. I will go to sleep tonight, and tomorrow morning I will either wake up to October 25th, or I will wake up to October 24th again, and we will have to figure out what still needs to change to break the pattern permanently." The remainder of that Tuesday afternoon unfolded with a strange quality of suspended reality, as if Marcus and I existed in a pocket of awareness separate from the normal flow of time that everyone else inhabited. We remained in his apartment, neither of us quite ready to return to our individual spaces and the solitude that would come with processing everything that had happened. The shock of averted disaster hung in the air between us, demanding acknowledgement while simultaneously defying any adequate response. Marcus made coffee with mechanical precision, going through familiar motions that seemed to ground him in physical reality, after hours of existing in the impossible space between past iterations and present outcomes. I accepted the mug he offered and wrapped my hands around it, appreciating the warmth against my palms even though the afternoon was not particularly cold. We sat across from each other in his living room, the silence between us surprisingly comfortable given the extraordinary circumstances that had brought us to this moment. "Tell me about the other iterations," I said finally, breaking the quiet with a request that felt simultaneously intrusive and necessary. "You mentioned you have lived through this day 7 times. What were the other attempts like? What did you try that failed?" Marcus took a long drink of his coffee before answering, his eyes distant as he accessed memories that I could not share but that had clearly left profound marks on his psyche. "The first time was the worst in some ways," he began, his voice low and measured. "I had no warning, no preparation, no understanding that anything unusual was happening. I woke up on what I thought was October 24th, went to work, did my job, came home in the evening. I saw the news reports about the explosion that had occurred downtown in the early afternoon. I watched footage of the Meridian building with smoke pouring from the upper floors, emergency responders working frantically, injured people being carried out on stretchers." He paused, his hands tightening around his coffee mug. "They released the names of the victims that evening during the 10 o'clock news broadcast. I was sitting here in this apartment on this same couch when they showed the list of confirmed deaths. I saw your name and I felt this strange sense of recognition. This awareness that I knew you even though we had never had any meaningful interaction beyond polite greetings in the hallway. Something about seeing your name on that list felt wrong in a way I cannot fully articulate, as if the universe had made an error that needed correcting. I went to bed that night thinking about the tragedy, feeling the general sadness that comes from learning about deaths in your community, people you sort of knew but did not actually know. Then I woke up the next morning and it was October 24th again. Same date on my phone, same news stories that I had already seen the previous day, same everything. I thought at first that I had simply misread the date, that I was confused or exhausted and had gotten my days mixed up. But as the morning progressed and everything unfolded exactly as I remembered it from the day before, I started to realize something impossible was happening. Marcus stood and walked to his desk, picking up the thick notebook he had shown me earlier. He opened it to the first page, which was covered in frantic handwriting that looked less organized than the later entries. "This was my attempt to document the second iteration," he explained. "I spent that entire day trying to prove to myself that I was not losing my mind, that this was actually happening. I made detailed notes about everything I observed, every conversation I overheard, every news story I read. Then when the explosion happened again at exactly the same time in exactly the same way, I knew with certainty that something beyond normal reality was occurring. The second night I barely slept. I kept thinking that maybe if I stayed awake, if I refused to surrender to unconsciousness, I could prevent the reset from happening. I made it until about 3 in the morning before exhaustion overwhelmed me. When I woke up, it was October 24th again. Third iteration. That was when I decided I needed to take action, to actively try to prevent the explosion rather than just observing and documenting. He returned to the couch, setting the notebook on the coffee table between us where I could see the dense pages filled with observations and failed strategies. The third time through, I called the police at 6 in the morning and reported that I had received information about a planned attack on the Meridian building. I tried to sound credible and serious. I provided specific details about the location of the bomb and the approximate time of detonation. The officer who took my report was professional and said they would investigate, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. How did I know about this threat? What was my source? Why was I calling anonymously if I had legitimate information? They sent a patrol car to drive past the building, but they did not conduct a search or force an evacuation based solely on my phone call. I watched the news throughout the morning, hoping to see reports of increased security or precautionary measures being taken, but there was nothing. The day proceeded exactly as it had in previous iterations until 12:45 when the bomb exploded and 12 people died. I felt responsible in a way I had not felt during the first 2 times because I had tried to prevent it and failed. The weight of that failure was crushing. Marcus's voice had taken on a hollow quality as he recounted these experiences, and I could see the psychological toll that repeated exposure to tragedy had taken on him. He was not just describing events he had observed, but trauma he had experienced over and over, watching people die while being unable to save them despite possessing foreknowledge that should have made prevention possible. The fourth iteration was when I tried to warn you directly, he continued. I waited outside the Meridian building that morning, arriving around 6:15 when I knew you typically got to work. When I saw you approaching the entrance, I ran up to you and tried to explain that you could not go inside, that there was going to be an explosion, that you needed to leave immediately. You looked at me like I was insane, which was a completely rational response. You told me to stay away from you or you would call security. When I tried to physically block your path, you did call security and they removed me from the premises. I watched from across the street as you entered the building, as the morning progressed normally for everyone who had no awareness of what was coming. At 12:45 the explosion occurred. I saw the blast, saw the windows blow out, saw the smoke and fire. I heard the screams and the chaos. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but by then the damage was done. You were already gone, along with 11 other people whose names I had memorized from previous iterations. The matter-of-fact way he described these events was somehow more disturbing than if he had been openly emotional. This was someone who had been forced to develop distance from trauma simply to remain functional through repeated exposure to it. He had watched me die, had watched multiple people die, not once but multiple times, and the only way he could continue trying to change the outcome was by creating psychological barriers between himself and the emotional impact of those deaths. The 5th time I tried calling in a bomb threat myself mid-morning, thinking that might trigger a more serious response than my earlier attempt to report advanced knowledge I should not have possessed. I found a payphone in a location far from my apartment and called in the threat around 11 o'clock, giving them 1 hour and 45 minutes before the scheduled detonation. The building was evacuated, but the process was slow and chaotic. Many people refused to leave without gathering important materials. You were one of them. Marcus looked directly at me now, and I could see the specific memory of that iteration reflected in his eyes. I was outside watching the evacuation when I saw you emerge from the building carrying your laptop case and several folders of documents. You looked annoyed rather than frightened, like this was an inconvenience rather than a genuine emergency. Then I saw you check your phone, and your expression changed. You turned around and went back into the building despite the evacuation order. I found out later from news reports that you had remembered important files you needed to back up to the company server before leaving. You went back to your office on the 18th floor to complete that task. You were still there when the bomb went off at 12:45. The image he described sent a chill through me because I could absolutely see myself making that choice, prioritizing work responsibilities over personal safety, in a moment of poor judgment. The dedication to my job that I had always considered a professional strength could easily become a fatal flaw in the wrong circumstances. If I had actually been in the building during an evacuation, if I had remembered important work that needed completing, I would likely have made the same decision that killed me in Marcus's fifth iteration of this day. The sixth time was the most aggressive intervention, Marcus said, his voice dropping lower. I decided that if warnings and phone calls were not sufficient, I needed to physically prevent people from entering the building in the first place. I positioned myself at the main entrance starting at 6 in the morning, and tried to stop everyone I recognized from previous iterations as being victims of the explosion. I told them the building was unsafe, that they could not go inside. Most people simply walked around me or told me to get out of their way. You arrived at your usual time and I grabbed your arm, tried to pull you away from the entrance. You fought me off and screamed for help. Building security responded immediately, restraining me and calling the police. I was arrested for assault and attempted kidnapping. They held me in a security office in a neighboring building, while they processed the arrest and waited for police transport. I was sitting in that office, handcuffed to a chair, when I heard the explosion at 12:45. I could see the Meridian building through the window of the security office. I watched it happen and I could not do anything except sit there restrained and helpless while people died because I had failed again. The anguish in his voice as he recounted this failure was palpable, and I felt a surge of compassion for this man who had been trapped in an impossible situation, forced to watch tragedy unfold repeatedly while being powerless to prevent it despite possessing the knowledge that should have made prevention possible. The psychological torture of that experience was beyond anything I could fully comprehend. This morning, the seventh iteration, I decided to try a completely different approach, Marcus continued. Instead of trying to warn authorities who would not believe me or trying to physically prevent people from entering the building, which only resulted in my own detention, I would focus entirely on keeping one person safe. I would keep you away from the building completely by waking you before dawn and convincing you to stay home. I had no certainty that this approach would work any better than the previous attempts, but I had exhausted every other strategy one could imagine. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression showing the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a battle for what felt like far longer than 7 days. When you actually listened to me this morning, when you agreed to stay home even though you had no rational reason to trust what I was telling you, I felt hope for the first time in these iterations. And when you called in the bomb threat as an actual employee of the company rather than as an anonymous source or someone with no credibility, and when the evacuation proceeded efficiently because your warning carried institutional weight that mine never could, I started to believe that maybe this time would actually be different. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of everything he had shared settling over us like a physical presence in the room. Outside the windows, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. The day that should have been marked by tragedy and death had instead become something else entirely. A day when disaster was averted and lives were saved through the desperate persistence of someone who refused to accept that the outcome was inevitable. My phone buzzed with another incoming message, this one from Derek Matheson asking if I had heard about the bomb threat at the office and whether I was okay. I sent a brief reply confirming that I was fine and had been working from home today, then set the phone down without engaging further. Something about Derek's message felt intrusive in a way I could not quite articulate, as if his concern was performative rather than genuine, but I pushed the feeling aside as uncharitable and likely influenced by the stress of the day's extraordinary events. What happens now? I asked Marcus, echoing the question I had posed earlier, but with new layers of meaning after hearing the full scope of his experience. If the loop is broken, if tomorrow morning you wake up to October 25th, what do you do with the knowledge of what you have been through? How do you process the trauma of living through the same day 7 times, of watching people die repeatedly, of carrying memories that no one else shares? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I honestly do not know, he admitted finally. Part of me wants to believe that if the loop breaks, the memories will fade or transform into something that feels less immediate and overwhelming. Maybe they will become like dreams, vivid in the moment but losing clarity and emotional intensity as time passes. But another part of me suspects that these experiences will stay with me permanently, that I will carry the weight of these 7 iterations for the rest of my life. I have read about people who experience trauma, how it changes brain structure and neural pathways, how the body holds memory of difficult experiences, even when the conscious mind tries to move past them. I have effectively experienced post-traumatic stress from events that, from the perspective of normal linear time, never actually occurred. How do you process trauma from a timeline that no longer exists? How do you mourn people who died in iterations that have been erased or overwritten? The philosophical and psychological complexity of his situation was staggering. If the time loop had indeed been broken, if tomorrow brought October 25th as it should, then from the perspective of everyone except Marcus, the events he had witnessed in previous iterations had never happened. The explosion that killed 12 people would be reduced to a bomb threat that was called in and successfully managed. A crisis averted rather than a tragedy experienced. But for Marcus, those deaths would remain real in memory even if they had been prevented in actual occurrence. "You saved lives today," I said firmly, wanting him to hear this clearly. 12 people who would have died are alive because you refused to give up, because you kept trying different approaches until you found one that worked. Jennifer Hastings is going to marry David next summer and build a life with him. Kenneth Brennan's daughters are going to have their father come home tonight. Patricia Sanders is going to retire in 3 weeks and enjoy the next phase of her life. Those outcomes exist because of you. Marcus met my eyes, and I saw tears there that he was working to contain. "I know," he said quietly. "Intellectually I know that. But the emotional reality is more complicated. I still carry the memory of watching those people die. I still remember reading their obituaries and seeing their families grieve. Those versions of events feel real to me even though they have been prevented from occurring. How do I reconcile the relief of having saved them with the trauma of having watched them die multiple times in other iterations?" "I think you give yourself permission to feel both things simultaneously," I offered, speaking from instinct rather than expertise since I had no experience that could truly parallel what he was describing. "You allow yourself to feel the pain of what you witnessed in previous iterations, while also allowing yourself to feel the satisfaction and relief of having changed the outcome. Human beings are capable of holding contradictory emotions at the same time. You do not have to choose between acknowledging your trauma and celebrating your success. Both things can be true." Marcus nodded slowly, as if considering the possibility that I might be right. Before he could respond, my phone rang with an incoming call from a number I did not recognize. I answered with some hesitation, uncertain who would be calling me from an unfamiliar line. "Claire Donovan?" a male voice asked, professional and official sounding. "Yes, this is Claire. This is Detective Robert Kensington with the Minneapolis Police Department. I am calling regarding the bomb threat that was reported at the Meridian Financial Services building this afternoon. We understand you were the employee who called in the initial report to emergency services. I need to ask you some questions about how you came to have information about this threat and why you were not in the building when you called it in." My stomach clenched with sudden anxiety. In the chaos and relief of having prevented the explosion, I had not fully considered that my role in calling in the threat would inevitably draw official attention and scrutiny. The police would naturally want to know how I had obtained advanced knowledge of a bomb that apparently did exist and was successfully located and disarmed during the building search. They would want to investigate whether I had any connection to the person or people responsible for planting the device. "I can answer your questions," I said, working to keep my voice steady despite the spike of fear coursing through me. "When would you like to meet?" "I can come to you now if you are available," Detective Kensington replied. "I am actually in your neighborhood following up on another matter. I could be at your address within 15 minutes if that works for you." I looked at Marcus, who had clearly overheard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. He nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that this was inevitable and necessary. "That would be fine," I told the detective. "I am in apartment 303 at the Berkshire Apartments on Hennepin Avenue." After ending the call, I stood and walked to Marcus's window, looking out at the street below where a detective would soon arrive asking questions I had no good answers for. How could I explain that my neighbor had woken me before dawn claiming to have foreknowledge of a bombing because he was trapped in a time loop? How could I make anyone believe that the reason I had called in the threat with such specific details and timing was because someone had lived through the same day 7 times and knew exactly when and where the explosion would occur? "You cannot tell them the truth," Marcus said quietly, and I turned to see him watching me with an expression of deep concern. They will not believe you. They will think you are either lying to cover up your own involvement in planting the bomb, or they will think you are experiencing delusions that somehow coincidentally align with an actual threat. Either way, telling them about the time loop will not help your situation and will likely make things significantly worse. So what do I tell them? I asked, feeling the stress of the entire day beginning to overwhelm me. I called in a bomb threat with specific information about location and timing. They found an actual bomb and successfully disarmed it based on the information I provided. They are going to want to know how I knew, and I cannot give them an answer that makes sense without revealing what actually happened. Marcus stood and came to stand beside me at the window. You tell them you received an anonymous tip, he said. Someone called you early this morning, someone whose voice you did not recognize, and they told you there was going to be a bomb at your workplace. You initially dismissed it as a prank or a disturbed person, which is why you called in sick rather than going to the office. But as the morning progressed and you thought more about it, you became increasingly concerned that the tip might be legitimate, so you called emergency services to report it even though you had no direct evidence. They are going to ask why someone would tip me specifically rather than calling authorities directly, I pointed out. They are going to question why an anonymous caller would reach out to a random data analyst rather than going through official channels. You tell them you do not know, Marcus said firmly. You tell them you found the call strange and troubling, that you have been trying to understand why someone would contact you with this information, but you have no explanation. You emphasize that you called it in because you felt an obligation to report potential danger, even though you were not certain the tip was credible. You acted out of an abundance of caution because the potential consequences of ignoring the warning were too severe to risk. I absorbed his advice, recognizing the wisdom of a story that was as close to the truth as possible while omitting the impossible elements that would only create additional problems. The detective would be skeptical, certainly, but skepticism about my sources was preferable to being suspected of direct involvement in planting the bomb or being dismissed as delusional. Will they investigate you as well? I asked Marcus. We are neighbors. They will likely canvass the building asking if anyone saw or heard anything unusual. If they discover that you woke me at 5 in the morning, if any other residents heard you pounding on my door, they will want to question you about your involvement. Let them investigate me, Marcus said with a weariness that spoke to how little he cared about such concerns compared to the larger battle he had been fighting. They will find nothing connecting me to the bomb or the person who planted it because I have no connection. I have a clean record, stable employment, and no history of concerning behavior. If they ask me questions, I will tell them I heard nothing unusual this morning, and have no information relevant to their investigation. The worst-case scenario is they waste some time looking into me before determining I am not a credible suspect. Before I could respond, there was a knock on Marcus's door. We looked at each other, startled by the unexpected interruption. Marcus walked to the door and checked the peephole, then opened it to reveal a man in his mid-40s wearing a suit and carrying a badge that he held up for identification. Detective Robert Kensington, Minneapolis Police, he said, his tone professional and neutral. I am looking for Claire Donovan. I was given apartment 303 as her address, but she did not answer when I knocked. A neighbor across the hall mentioned seeing her enter this unit earlier today. I am Claire Donovan, I said, stepping forward so the detective could see me. This is my neighbor Marcus Chun. I have been here this afternoon because we have been discussing the bomb threat and the evacuation of my workplace. I can answer your questions. Detective Kensington assessed both of us with the practiced eye of someone trained to read people and situations. He was tall with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested years of experience dealing with the complexity of human behavior at its worst. His expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing about what he was thinking or what conclusions he might be drawing about finding me in my neighbor's apartment rather than my own. May I come in? He asked, directing the question to Marcus as the resident of the unit. Of course, Marcus said, stepping aside to allow the detective entry. Would you like to sit down? Can I offer you coffee or water? Water would be appreciated, thank you, Detective Kensington said, settling himself on the chair I had occupied earlier while I returned to the couch. Marcus retreated to the kitchen to get water, leaving me alone with the detective whose attention was now fully focused on me. Miss Donovan, I want to start by saying that your call to emergency services this afternoon very likely saved multiple lives. The detective began, his tone measured and professional. The bomb that was located in the Meridian building was sophisticated and would have caused significant casualties had it detonated as planned. The bomb squad was able to disarm it successfully thanks to the specific information you provided about its location and the time frame they were working with. You should feel good about the action you took today. I am relieved that people are safe, I said carefully, aware that this opening statement was designed to make me comfortable before the more difficult questions began. That was my primary concern when I decided to make the call. I need to understand how you came to have information about this bomb, Detective Kensington said, pulling out a small notebook and pen. You called emergency services at 12:39 this afternoon and reported that there was a bomb on the 18th floor of the Meridian Financial Services building set to detonate at 12:45. That information was remarkably specific and accurate. How did you know these details? Marcus returned with glasses of water for all of us, then sat down on the opposite end of the couch from me. I appreciated his quiet presence, the unspoken support of someone who understood the full truth, even if I could not share it with the detective. I received a phone call early this morning, I began, following the story Marcus and I had constructed. Around 5 o'clock. The caller did not identify themselves and I did not recognize the voice. They told me that there was going to be a bomb at my workplace today, and that I should not go into the office. I initially thought it was a prank or a disturbed person who had somehow gotten my number. I hung up and tried to go back to sleep. But you did not go into work today, the detective observed. You called in sick shortly after that phone call, according to records we obtained from your employer. That suggests you took the threat more seriously than you are indicating. I was unsettled by the call, I admitted. Even though I told myself it was probably nothing, I could not completely dismiss it. I decided to work from home as a precaution. That way I would not be in the office if the threat turned out to be real, but I would not be making a dramatic scene by reporting something that was most likely a hoax. Detective Kensington made notes in his small notebook, his pen moving across the page with quick efficiency. Did the caller provide any other information? Did they explain how they knew about the bomb or why they were warning you specifically rather than contacting authorities directly? No, I said, which had the benefit of being essentially true. Marcus had not explained how he knew in that early morning conversation, only that I needed to trust him and stay away from the building. The call was brief and the person seemed agitated or frightened. They gave me the warning and ended the call before I could ask questions. And the phone number the call came from? Do you still have that information in your call history? This was a question I had anticipated. I checked my phone after the call, and the number showed as blocked or unavailable. There was no caller ID information I could use to trace it back. The detective's expression suggested he found this convenient but not impossible. Blocked numbers were common enough in harassing or threatening calls. What made you decide to call in the threat this afternoon rather than earlier in the day? If you received the warning at 5 in the morning, why wait until 12:39 to report it? I spent the morning trying to decide if I should take it seriously, I said, and this at least was completely honest. I had spent the morning in Marcus's apartment trying to determine if he was telling the truth or experiencing delusions, weighing impossible evidence against rational skepticism. I kept thinking it must be a hoax or a mistake, that I would look foolish reporting something based on an anonymous phone call from an unknown person. But as noon approached, I became increasingly anxious. I started thinking about all the people in that building, my colleagues and friends, and I realized I could not live with myself if something happened and I had said nothing. So you called emergency services and provided specific details about the location of the bomb and the time of planned detonation. Where did those specific details come from if the caller this morning did not provide them? This was the dangerous question, the one where my story became less solid. The caller mentioned the 18th floor specifically, I said, improvising carefully, and they said it would happen around midday. I interpreted that to mean sometime between noon and 1 o'clock. When I called in the report, I estimated 12:45 as a midpoint in that time frame. I provided the 18th floor detail exactly as it had been given to me. Detective Kensington studied me for a long moment, his experienced gaze searching for tells or inconsistencies that might indicate I was lying or omitting important information. I met his eyes with what I hoped was appropriate calm. Someone who was nervous about being questioned by police, but had nothing to hide beyond the impossible truth about time loops that I could never reveal. Miss Donovan, I want to be very clear with you about something, the detective said, his tone becoming more serious. The person who planted this bomb has been identified as Thomas Vega, a former employee of Meridian Financial Services who was terminated and prosecuted for embezzlement 6 months ago. Mr. Vega was arrested approximately an hour ago at his apartment when bomb-making materials matching the device found in your building were discovered during a search. He has a significant grudge against the company and a demonstrated willingness to cause harm. The detective leaned forward slightly. What I need to understand is whether you have any connection to Thomas Vega, any relationship or communication that might explain why someone would specifically warn you about his plans. Did you know Mr. Vega during his employment at Meridian? Did you have any involvement in his termination or prosecution? Is there any reason he might want to contact you about this situation? I did not know Thomas Vega, I said honestly. I was aware that someone in the accounting department had been fired for embezzlement earlier this year, but I did not know the person's name or any details beyond general office gossip. I work in data analytics on the same floor as accounting but in a different department with minimal overlap. I have no reason to believe Thomas Vega knew who I was, or would have any motivation to contact me specifically. Then we are back to the question of why an anonymous caller would choose to warn you, Detective Kensington said. If you had no connection to either the bomber or anyone who might have known about his plans, why would someone call you with this information rather than going directly to authorities? I do not know, I said, which was the truth from a certain perspective. I did not know why the universe or fate or whatever force controlled the time loop had trapped Marcus rather than someone else, had made him the person who experienced October 24th 7 times, while everyone else moved through linear time unaware of the repeated iterations. I have been trying to understand that myself. The only explanation I can think of is that perhaps the caller chose a random employee from company records, someone they thought might take the warning seriously and pass it along to authorities. Or perhaps they knew my direct line at work and had me confused with someone else they meant to contact. I genuinely have no answer to that question. Detective Kensington made more notes, then looked over at Marcus, who had been sitting quietly throughout this entire exchange. Mr. Chun, did you hear or see anything unusual this morning? Your neighbor mentioned receiving a disturbing phone call around 5 o'clock. Did you hear anything that might be relevant to the investigation? Marcus shook his head calmly. I did not hear anything unusual this morning. I work remotely and keep fairly irregular hours, so I was likely asleep at 5. I knew nothing about the bomb threat until I saw news reports this afternoon about the evacuation and the investigation at the Meridian building. Claire came over to talk about it because she was understandably shaken by everything that had happened. The detective studied Marcus with the same assessing gaze he had directed at me, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. Marcus's expression remained neutral and cooperative, someone who had nothing to hide and was simply answering questions to the best of his ability. How long have you lived in this building, Mr. Chun? The detective asked. Approximately 3 years. I moved here when my company transitioned to fully remote work, and I no longer needed to be physically present in Seattle. And your relationship with Miss Donovan? How well do you know each other? We are friendly neighbors but not particularly close. We greet each other in the hallway, occasionally accept package deliveries for each other, the typical interactions of people who live across the hall from one another. Today is actually the longest conversation we have ever had. Detective Kensington made a final series of notes, then closed his notebook and stood. Thank you both for your cooperation, he said, handing me a business card. Miss Donovan, if you remember any additional details about the phone call this morning, or if the caller attempts to contact you again, I need you to reach out to me immediately. This investigation is ongoing and any information you can provide may be valuable. I will certainly contact you if I remember anything else or if anything else occurs, I assured him, accepting the card and tucking it into my pocket. The detective let himself out, and Marcus and I sat in silence for several minutes after the door closed behind him. The tension that had gripped me throughout the interview slowly began to ease, though I remained aware that the detective's questions represented only the beginning of official interest in my role in preventing the bombing. There would likely be follow-up investigations, additional questions, continued scrutiny of my story and my background. You did well, Marcus said quietly. Your answers were consistent and believable. He is suspicious because investigators are trained to be suspicious, but you did not give him any concrete reason to think you were lying or involved in something criminal. I hate lying to the police, I said, feeling the moral weight of having deliberately misled someone who was trying to do their job and solve a serious crime. But you were right that telling the truth would have been worse. There was no way to explain the actual situation without sounding delusional or suspicious. The lie you told was in service of a greater truth, Marcus offered. You prevented a bombing and saved lives. The specific mechanism by which you obtained that foreknowledge is less important than the outcome. Sometimes deception in small matters is necessary to protect larger truths that no one would believe if stated directly. I looked at him, this man who had sacrificed his own peace and sanity to save people he barely knew, who had persisted through failure after failure until he found an approach that worked. What you did today was extraordinary, I said. I know you are struggling with the trauma of what you experienced in previous iterations, but I need you to understand that you are a hero. You saved 12 lives through sheer determination and refusal to accept that the outcome was inevitable. Marcus's expression showed complex emotions I could not fully parse. I do not feel like a hero, he admitted. I feel exhausted and traumatized and uncertain whether any of this was real, or if I will wake up tomorrow morning to October 24th again. But thank you for saying it. Thank you for believing me when you had every rational reason not to. Thank you for making that call to emergency services, even though it put you in an uncomfortable position with authorities. You were the missing piece that made this iteration different from all the others. We sat together as the afternoon faded into evening, two people connected by extraordinary circumstances, waiting to discover whether tomorrow would bring October 25th or whether the impossible cycle would continue, demanding further interventions and further attempts to break a pattern that had already been shattered once today but might reassert itself with the dawn. The evening that followed Detective Kensington's departure carried a weight of suspension, as if the entire world were holding its breath waiting for some final resolution that had not yet arrived. Marcus and I remained in his apartment as daylight faded and the streetlights below flickered to life one by one, casting their familiar yellow glow across the neighborhood that continued its ordinary existence completely unaware of the extraordinary events that had transpired within the invisible boundaries of a now broken time loop. I should have returned to my own apartment across the hall. The rational part of my mind recognized that I needed space to process everything that had happened, that remaining in Marcus's presence prolonged the intensity of emotions that required solitary reflection to properly integrate. But something kept me rooted to his couch, some instinctive understanding that we were both experiencing a form of shock that made isolation dangerous and connection necessary, even if that connection came from someone I had barely known 24 hours ago. Marcus ordered food delivery from a Thai restaurant several blocks away, neither of us having eaten anything substantial since morning and both of us recognizing that our bodies required fuel even when our minds were too preoccupied to generate appropriate hunger signals. We ate in companionable silence, the familiar flavors of pad thai and green curry providing small anchors to normalcy in a day that had departed so completely from normal experience. After we finished eating, I finally voiced the question that had been circling through my mind since the bomb had failed to detonate at its appointed time. What was it like? I asked Marcus, who was clearing away the takeout containers with methodical attention to a simple task. Living through the same day 7 times. What did that actually feel like from the inside? Marcus paused in his cleaning, his hands still for a moment as he considered the question. He returned to the living room and sat down, his expression showing the effort required to translate experience into language that could adequately convey the psychological reality of his situation. The first 2 iterations were disorienting in a way that is difficult to describe. He began slowly, choosing his words with care. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that yesterday has returned, that time has somehow reversed itself, and you are the only person who remembers that this day already occurred. Your first instinct is to question your own sanity. You wonder if you are having some kind of psychotic break, if stress or illness has caused your mind to manufacture false memories or distort your perception of time. I spent the entire second iteration trying to prove to myself that I was not losing my mind. I made detailed observations of everything around me, looking for discrepancies that would indicate this was a new day, rather than a repetition of the previous one. But everything unfolded exactly as I remembered it. Conversations happened word for word. News stories reported identical information. Events occurred at precisely the same times with precisely the same outcomes. The weight of evidence became overwhelming. This was not delusion or false memory. This was actual temporal repetition, and I was somehow caught in it. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at the darkening street below. By the third iteration, once I had accepted that this was really happening, the psychological impact shifted. Instead of questioning my sanity, I started questioning my responsibility. If I was the only person aware that time was repeating, if I possessed foreknowledge of a tragedy that was going to occur, did I have an obligation to try to prevent it? Could I live with myself if I simply went through the day passively, allowing events to unfold as they had in previous iterations when I knew people were going to die? The answer was clearly no. I could not passively allow those deaths to occur when I had advance warning. So I started trying interventions, and that is when the real psychological torture began. Because each failed attempt compounded the trauma. I was not just witnessing tragedy once. I was witnessing it repeatedly, with the added burden of knowing that my efforts to prevent it had been insufficient. Each iteration became another layer of failure, another weight of responsibility for deaths I could not prevent despite possessing knowledge that should have made prevention possible. I listened in silence, trying to imagine what that experience must have been like. The crushing weight of repeated failure combined with the isolation of being the only person aware that any of this was happening. Marcus was describing a form of psychological torture that few human beings would ever experience. Trapped in a cycle where every day brought fresh trauma disguised as familiar repetition. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.